Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roeder, your comments about the incentives of a corporation are accurate, which is they're trying to make as much money as they can, and to do so, they're trying to get as many eyeballs as they can. Every newspaper, every magazine, every TV show, every broadcaster, every radio station does the same thing, which is how can we get more eyeballs, what gets more attention. And what we're seeing with social media is not entirely unprecedented. I imagine I wasn't around in the early days of broadcast, but I presume it was Wild West initially, and then there was threat of government intervention to tell you who could advertise and what they could advertise and what words could be said and how much sex and violence could be allowed. And the industry came together and said, okay, we're going to start grading things and establishing rules. Ultimately, from what I understand, the government also established an entity to establish rules for broadcasting, saying what you could show at certain hours of the day, how much sex and violence and so forth could be on broadcast networks. And we haven't done that with regards to social media. Social media is far more engaging and captivating of our young people, as well as many adults, than broadcast was. And I wonder whether we need to do this. One, whether the industry should not come together and talk about its own decision-making, the rules, where they draw the lines, and say, yeah, these are things we are all going to agree to. And if the industry doesn't do that, whether government should, whether we should establish an agency to say, hey, these are the rules, and you're all going to have to follow them. Is the industry willing to take action of that nature? Could it? Should it? And if not, should government? And I'll ask you, Mr. Roeder, first, and then Mr. Boland and Mr. Kane.
So I think that probably the best predictor here is just past behavior. So far, my observation is the industry will share information which is not the information you would share if you were genuinely interested in providing transparency. Brian's talked somewhat about sharing an average when you have a distribution which is so non-uniform that an average is not a useful statistic. We see that. We see exact numbers being shared. I view this as a two-step process. The first is we actually don't know what's happening on these networks today, and that's why a lot of the conversation about networks devolves into cherry-picking examples to prove something that I believe these networks are doing. And you can also prove that they have a bias in the other direction, depending on which example you cherry-pick. The first step is we need statistically representative, unbiased, raw data that can be processed, and then we understand what they're actually doing. I think if we had a better view of what they were actually doing in a representative way, we could then talk about, do we believe their incentives are going to create the right outcome? What is the true impact of that? And then, faced with that shared understanding of what the networks are doing, it's possible, to your point, that maybe the companies would come together and decide to self-regulate because they realize the specter of someone else regulating them is worse. I'm not sure. But I think really the first step is demanding the transparency so we have a shared view on what's actually happening on these things.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Boland?
Yeah, I think that usually you see industries take self-regulatory steps when they feel like external pressures or legislation's impending. And,
right.
I don't believe that they feel that with the United States today. And I think that drives a decision from them to kind of let the status quo go. I think what's particularly terrifying is that we don't know what's happening on these platforms today. The nice thing about broadcast, excuse me, is that you know what was broadcast. Everyone could see what was being broadcast. With the way that our feeds work today, you have such a distribution of content that it can look at, on an average basis, that things are getting better. The industry could tell you, we're making improvements. Here's the average that shows you what we're doing. But for the person who has the 99th percentile most hate-filled feed, or the group of people who have that 99th percentile most extremist feed, they may be seeing an increase in the types of harmful content that we'll never know. So in an era where you see steps being made to reduce transparency, so Meta provided a lot more transparency 3 years ago than they provide today. That transparency is decreasing. None of the other platforms are taking steps in that regard to increase transparency. And you have an increased TikTokization of media, in that Facebook is now moving towards a TikTok model, where it's not just friends and family content, it is unconnected, algorithmically driven content. These kind of fringes, these pockets are going to grow. We'll never see them unless we mandate that we get to see them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Senator Romney, for the question. TikTok has seen an alarming number of leaks get out in the press, which does suggest, and I have spoken personally with former TikTok employees who have been disgruntled, who say that the company is not transparent, that it's not doing what it promises. Since it has this connection to the Chinese Communist Party, it will not be transparent about what it's doing. This algorithm, we don't know what's behind the curtain. China is not a place that values transparency. It is a one-party authoritarian state and the most sophisticated police state in the world. I don't think we can count on a company such as TikTok or its parent ByteDance to do anything that will actually address the problems at hand. I think that, to be honest, this committee is uniquely placed to address this problem of transparency because the subpoena power that can be used here, I think, would require TikTok to open up its emails, show us what's really going on, and show us what the China-based executives are saying with the American executives.
Yeah, I must admit I share your view in that regard, although I'm probably even more alarmist than you, which is I question whether we should allow an authoritarian regime to have a social media capability of the scale they have in our country, gathering the data they have. I think that's a huge risk for us. I have a lot of kids and grandkids, particularly grandkids these days, very concerned about their exposure to social media. Have other countries figured a better way, and I know I don't have a lot of time here, but a better way to try and reduce the draw and the compelling nature of social media? I understand China, for instance, between various TikTok segments, they have a 5-second gap where the screening, I guess, goes blank or something. But are we not doing even what other nations are doing to try and protect our kids? And I'll let anyone wants to respond to that. Maybe Brian, if you want to take that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one in that you're dealing with incentives you would mandate versus steps you'd like to see the companies take on their own. There are steps that you're describing friction, right? That slow down the kind of effective process. There are known steps you can take to introduce friction in the products.
Have other nations done? Have some of the other nations done some of those things?
I don't know of mandated friction. I think Europe has done a very good job of starting to move towards required transparency. So we'll see how that moves, but haven't seen the prescriptive type of product stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.